All right, so yeah, no change immediately upon hopping in the truck, but let's go ahead and fire the truck up. We'll put the plastic piece cover back on this, and then we'll pull it out of the garage and see where we're at.
All right, so I'm gonna be pretty honest here. I'm still not satisfied with the way the truck drove. When I was hitting bumps, I was getting a lot of bump steer, and I think it's because I was missing that one part of my steering rack. And I also have concern in my lower control arm, especially the ball joint. It's pretty loose, so I'm afraid if I get the truck aligned, it won't stay aligned because of that. So let's go ahead and get to the video. I did find a lot more issues with this truck, so let's delve into that.
All right, so after putting everything back together, I'm actually going to throw an audible here, and I'm going to replace everything. So I went ahead and ordered new brakes, new rotors, a new CV axle, lower control arm, and wheel bearing. That way I don't have to touch any of this for a very long time. And because my lower control arm ball bearing is already bad, and that's going to mess with the alignment, we're going to replace everything since it's out. And for, I don't know, probably about $200, I can go ahead and replace both this side, and then another $200 replace the other side, being the driver's side. So let's go ahead and disassemble everything. And while it's disassembled, let's go ahead and repaint the knuckle and the brake caliper here as well, both the bracket and the caliper itself. Since we have all that disassembled. That way it cleans up everything up front, and I don't have to worry about it again for a very long time. So, all right, and I wanted to kind of talk how I'm going to be doing this. And the first thing I'm going to do is go ahead and take the brake caliper off, and that's going to be just the bracket bolts, or one here and then one down below. From there, I went ahead and took the cover off, so that way I can show the CV axle nut, and that's going to be a 34 millimeter for my particular truck. So we'll back that off, and then we'll be able to essentially hammer it out of the wheel bearing. From there, we'll release the 8 retaining bolts, if I can zoom in there, and they should be 15 millimeters. So remove all 8 of those around the CV axle, and that'll make removing the CV axle much easier. From there, we'll drop the tie rod and then also the sway bar link here, and then we'll work the upper and then finally the lower control arm. And to remove the lower control arm, the CV axle has to be removed. So if you do it in this order, it'll make things a lot easier, and this is how I'm going to be doing it. So let's start. Quick tip here when removing the front end here. What you want to do is go ahead and remove the tie rod first. That way you can actually manipulate the knuckle here and be able to get access to the bolts a lot easier on the back end of the caliper. So if you release the tie rod, it just makes things a lot easier. And then always put your bolts back where you get them. So the 10 millimeter here for the brake line bracket, go ahead and put it back into its hole, and then obviously put the castle nut and retaining pin back onto the tie rod here. But that just keeps everything nice, super easy and clean, and you don't have a million different bolts flying off and different nuts and things at the end that you deal with. So just put things back where they belong, and it'll just make things a lot easier, make this job much quicker. All right, so we got the brake caliper bracket off of the rotor and the brake caliper hanging off here. Additionally, we removed the rotor from the wheel bearing. That way to make things a lot easier and less things get in the way. Furthermore, we're going to release the CV axle nut here. And again, that's a 34 millimeter, and then the 8 bolts that are retaining it from the drive line over here. So once all of those bolts are released and the CV axle nut is released, we'll go ahead and hammer this through the wheel bearing and pull that CV axle out. Alrighty, to access those bolts, what I'm using is a long extension with a 15 mil on the end, and I'm reaching in and hitting the top bolt right there as I turn them around. So I'll hit that, back it out, and work my way to all the other ones. To best access that, all you have to do is turn the wheel bearing here and then get access to what you need. But once all 8 of those are released, this will just pop right down, and then we'll be able to hammer this tip of the CV axle through the wheel bearing. So let's go ahead and finish this up. Now that we have the 8 bolts removed from the driveline there, all we have to do now is take a BFH and go ahead and hit the front of the CV axle here, and it'll push it through the wheel bearing. So let's go ahead and hit it with the hammer. All right, so I guess my BFH wasn't big enough, so let's go ahead and put some WD-40 on here on the rust and go ahead and break down, let it sit here for probably about 30 minutes, and then we'll go back after it. So yeah, so I was mushrooming the top of the CV axle here, which I don't really care because I'm replacing it, but still, some of this WD-40 will help loosen up some of that rust and corrosion that's in there. And this just happens over time, but this is original. I don't think these have ever been replaced. So 10 years of life on these things, well needed to be replaced. But let's go ahead and let it sit on here, and then we'll hammer it back out. So we do have the CV axle out now. After about 30 or so hits, I was able to hammer it out of the wheel bearing there. It was completely seized in there, but flipping between blaster and WD-40, I was I let it sit on the CV axle for about 30 minutes while I ate dinner. Came back out, hammered it out. Took about, I'd say 20 to 30 heavy swings on it, and she finally released from inside there. From now, we're gonna flip around, turn it to the side, and we'll take care of the 4 bolts back here. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And that's gonna take off the whole wheel bearing mount, then also release the dust cover here for the brakes. So let's go ahead and remove those 4 and get the wheel bearing off of the knuckle. All right, so with 2 hands, I was able to slide it right off, just a quick wiggle, and she came right off of the knuckle here. And then the dust cover right here was in between the knuckle and wheel bearing. So that made things a lot easier. Typically, on most trucks I've worked on, this is completely seized up. Typically, you gotta take a hammer and hammer this around on the wheel bearing to release from the knuckle, but with this dust cover in between the wheel bearing and knuckle, made things a lot easier. There was a lot less corrosion. You can see some of it right here, but overall the surface is super clean. And I'll put some anti-seize on this when it goes back on, so whoever ends up replacing these wheel bearings down the road, if not me, won't have to deal with any corrosion. All right, so now that everything's removed from the knuckle, we're going to release the upper control arm and then the lower control arm, and then we'll also release the sway bar link right here. That way the lower control arm can drop, and then we'll hit the retaining bolts back here next to the torsion bar, and then up front right here that we'll take care of. Just knocked my light down, but yep. So let's go ahead and finish up here, and then we'll go ahead and start cleaning this knuckle up and painting it. All right, so I wanted to cover a quick tip here. Once you've released the lower control arm bushings there and back there, I haven't touched the torsion keys, and you're actually able to slide the lower control arm off of the truck. So if you're having issues with the torsion bars, don't worry about it, because you can release the lower control arms without messing with the torsion keys. So let's go ahead and slide it off the torsion bar, and then we'll go ahead and remove the knuckle from the lower control arm, because I had difficulties prior with the pickle fork. So we'll just hammer it off once I had the lower control arm off the truck. So slid the lower control arm off the torsion bar, and you can see here there's a lot of corrosions. I'm gonna go ahead and clean this up before I put the new control arm in. That way I don't have to deal with any of this later on in life. But just a little wiggling and pulled it right off of the lower control arm. Let's move to the next step. Now, as always, I wanted to show a comparison between the new lower control arm and then the old control arm that was on the driver's side of the truck. And I was able to remove the lower control arm without removing the torsion key, which the torsion bar goes through the lower control arm here. I was able just to slide it out, so didn't have to touch any torsion key in terms of lowering it or adjusting it. So outside of having to remove the CV axle to get to the lower control arm here, made things a lot easier and less tools required for this job. But overall, brand new ball joint here. You have your lower part shock bushing here, and then you have your bushings here and here, all brand new on the Moog lower control arm. And then for the lower original control arm here, you can see how much play is actually in this bushing. And then if I can zoom in, there's cracks and wear on the lower shock bushing here on the back side. So it's already wearing out. And then there's also cracks and wear on the bushing here for the lower control arm, and then also on the other side. So that's just a quick look at the 2 lower control arms and what I'm putting into the truck. And it's already nice and blacked out. There's not a lot of rust on it. There's some residual rust that came from factory, but we'll go ahead and clean that up before we put it in. But without further ado, let's get started. Okay, so we're about 4 hours in now. We removed the wheel bearings, CV axles, rotors, brake pads, lower control arm, and then also the knuckle. But what I'm also working on is painting all the parts that I'm pulling off in terms of the ones I'm gonna be keeping. And for the parts I'm keeping are gonna be the knuckles, the dust covers, and then the brackets for the truck. And then I'm also keeping the brake calipers, which are not pictured. I'm gonna paint those black, but I'm going with this gray metallic and black scheme, which is not too fancy or flashy, keeping it fairly OEM, but just wanna kind of show the comparison between the old part that came off the truck, and this is gonna be the passenger side that I just removed, versus the driver's side that I've already sanded, primed, and painted. Man, do these look good. Super happy with the way they're turning out. And I'm using just some of Rust-Oleum product for both the primer and enamel top. And man, does it look good. Super happy with how this is turning out. Go ahead and get these sanded down, cleaned up, primed, and painted, and then onto the truck with about 24 to 48 hours to cure. So let's get after it. Part 3 of this series, what we're gonna do is go ahead and drop the front axle of the truck and replace both the axle seals, both the passenger side over here and then also the driver's side on the opposite side. There are 4 retaining bolts, one right here, one on the other side, and then 2 that are on the driver's side of the truck. All you have to do is go ahead and drop those. You'll also want to release the wiring harness for the actuator here going into for your 4-wheel drive, and then there should be like a breather hose also on the other side. But release the 4 bolts, the wiring harness, and the breather hose, and then you'll be able to drop your axle. You do want to go ahead and release the front skid plate here to gain better access, obviously, because this thing has to come down. So drop your skid plate as well. And then this does make it a lot easier because I don't have anything else up here, including the CV axles are completely missing right now. So a great time to go ahead and drop the axle and replace both those seals. So let's go ahead and get after it. All right, now I did want to add one thing that I forgot to add in the previous part was to actually disconnect the front drive shaft. And then there's also one retaining bolt on the other side of here by the drive shaft. So go ahead and loosen that up. And then for the wiring harness for the actuator here, you'll undo it from a top clip here. Let me see if I can grab the wiring harness. I'll drop it down for you to actually look at it. So there's a retaining clip up top. You'll disconnect that, and then there will be a clip holding on the wiring harness here on top of the actuator, and then also on top of the pumpkin here. So there's 3 retaining clips you'll have to loosen to actually get this off of the front differential. So just something to keep in mind as you get through this. Now we're going to go ahead and loosen up all 4 bolts here, and we'll go ahead and drop the front differential.
All right, thank you guys so much for watching. It is now the next day. I'm kind of doing this all simultaneously, painting, removing parts, and so forth. Tried to really dig into this truck and get everything fixed and squared away. I did notice, as you saw, a leak on my axle, so I will be dropping the axle, replacing those axle seals as we wait for parts to arrive. But in addition to replacing those axle seals, I did notice other miscellaneous parts that I'm going to replace too. And that's going to be my ignition switch up front here, and then also the shift boot that I noticed was damaged when I was tightening up the steering column. So we're going to go ahead and replace all of that in part 3 of this series. So make sure you stay tuned to that. And then, I don't know if you noticed, the leak that's above the axle, it's red fluid. So I think what it is going to be the transmission lines, possibly. I'll have to do some more diag on it. But if I was a betting man, I would say those transmission lines. So we're gonna take a look at that. I'll save that for a whole different series of getting those replaced, and probably go a whole different route than the aluminum lines the truck comes with, because those are notorious for leaking. So stay tuned for that. But in part 3, like I said, we're gonna replace the axle seals and a couple other miscellaneous parts. And then I ordered also some cosmetic things for the truck to replace some of the old parts that I saw. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss that. But we'll catch you guys next time. Thanks for watching.